Martha had spent days preparing for this moment, her frail hands trembling slightly as she packed a modest suitcase. The years had etched lines into her face, and the gray in her hair had deepened. Her small, modest home, tucked away in a quiet town in North Carolina, was the complete opposite of the towering luxury that awaited her in New York City. Her son, Michael, had made a life for himself far away, both in distance and, it seemed, in heart. She hadn't seen Michael in years, not since the funeral of her husband. The loss of her lifelong partner had left her devastated, and the only solace she had found was in the hope that she could still be a part of her son's life. But the calls became less frequent, the visits non-existent. It was Michael's busy schedule, she told herself. He was successful now, living the life he had always dreamed of. She had raised him to reach for the stars, to aim for more than she could ever provide. And he had succeeded. But as she stood at the door of her humble home, the doubt crept in. Will he even be happy to see me? She wondered. It wasn't as if he had invited her. The decision to visit had been hers alone, a decision born out of a longing too great to ignore. She hadn't called ahead. What if he said no? What if he made an excuse like all the other times? No, she had to go in person. Maybe then, just maybe, he would see her and realize how much they had drifted apart. Maybe the sight of his aging mother would spark something in him. With a deep breath, she locked the door behind her and started the long journey. The bus ride from North Carolina to New York City was grueling for a woman her age, but Martha had insisted on making the trip herself. Michael would never approve of her traveling this way. He would send for a private car or buy her a plane ticket. But that was part of the problem, wasn't it? His wealth had built an invisible wall between them, a wall that had grown thicker and taller with every passing year. As the bus rolled down the highway, Martha's mind drifted back to simpler times. She remembered Michael as a little boy, full of dreams and ambition, but always with a kind heart. He would run to her after school, eager to share stories of his day. His eyes sparkled with the energy of youth, and he always made her laugh with his wild imagination. How could that bright-eyed boy have grown into the distant, polished man who rarely had time for her? The years had flown by so quickly. Martha had done everything she could to give Michael the best life possible, even after his father passed. She had worked long hours as a nurse, taking extra shifts to pay for his education, sacrificing her own comforts to ensure he had every opportunity. And Michael had taken those opportunities and soared. But in the process, something had shifted. It wasn't immediate. There was no single moment she could point to when she had lost him. It had been gradual, like sand slipping through her fingers. The city loomed closer as the bus approached its destination. Martha's heart pounded as the tall skyscrapers came into view. She had visited New York once before, when Michael had first moved here for college. Back then, he was still her boy, calling her every weekend, sharing stories of his classes, his new friends, his dreams. But the Michael who lived here now was a stranger to her in so many ways. When the bus finally pulled into the station, Martha felt a wave of exhaustion. Her legs ached as she stepped off, but the determination in her heart pushed her forward. She caught a cab, clutching her worn purse tightly in her lap as the city lights blurred past the window. It was evening by the time she arrived at Michael's house, and she gazed in awe at the towering building before her. His home was nothing like the small, cozy house she had raised him in. This was a mansion, a symbol of the success he had worked so hard to achieve. She was proud of him, of course she was. But why did it feel so painful to see how far apart their lives had become? Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorbell. For a moment, she considered turning back. What if Michael wasn't happy to see her? What if this visit was a mistake? But no, she had come too far. She pressed the bell and waited, her heart pounding in her chest. The door opened and a woman stood there. It wasn't Michael. It was Amanda, his wife, someone Martha had only seen in photographs. Amanda's expression was polite, but not warm. She looked surprised to see the older woman standing there, suitcase in hand. "Oh, Martha," Amanda said, her voice carefully measured. "We weren't expecting you." I know, dear. I wanted to surprise Michael," Martha replied, her voice trembling with both nerves and hope. She forced a smile, though Amanda's reaction made her stomach twist. Amanda glanced back into the house before stepping aside. "Come in," she said, though there was no genuine warmth in her tone. The house was grand, decorated with modern art and expensive furniture. Martha felt small and out of place as she stepped inside, her worn shoes sinking into the plush carpet. "Michael's still at work," Amanda said, closing the door behind them. "He didn't mention you were coming." "I didn't tell him," Martha confessed softly. "I thought it might be nice to surprise him." Amanda gave a tight-lipped smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course," she said. "Well, make yourself comfortable. I'm sure he'll be home soon." As Martha sat down on the edge of an elegant sofa, she looked around. There were no photographs of her or of Michael's childhood anywhere in sight. No reminders of the life they had once shared. The realization stung more than she had expected. "This is Michael's world now," she thought. "A world I don't belong in." But deep inside, she still clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, her son hadn't forgotten her completely. As she sat there, waiting, the silence in the grand house grew heavier, pressing down on her chest. She had come so far, surely Michael would be glad to see her, right? The minutes dragged by as Martha sat in the large, pristine living room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was acutely aware of how out of place she felt in this elegant space. The silence around her was deafening, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the house. Amanda had left the room shortly after offering her a cup of tea, which Martha politely declined. Now she was alone, with only her thoughts for company. She gazed around, trying to appreciate the beauty of Michael's home. But the more she looked, the more she felt the weight of everything that had changed. The house was immaculate, like something from a magazine, but it was also sterile, cold, even. The walls were adorned with expensive art, the furniture sleek and modern, but there was nothing personal about the space. No family photos, no signs of the life she had once shared with her son. It was as if the past had been erased, and with it, her presence in his life. Martha sighed and shifted uncomfortably on the couch. She hadn't expected fanfare when she arrived, but the coldness of Amanda's reception had caught her off guard. She had hoped for warmth, for some sign that she was still welcome in her son's life, but the distance she had felt from Amanda was undeniable. It wasn't just politeness. There was something deeper, something that made Martha feel as though her presence was a burden. The door creaked open, and Martha looked up, her heart skipping a beat. But it wasn't Michael. Amanda had returned, her expression still unreadable. "Would you like anything? Tea? Coffee?" Amanda asked again, her tone more obligatory than genuine. "No, thank you," Martha replied softly. She couldn't help but notice that Amanda seemed more interested in her phone than in engaging with her guest. There was an awkward pause before Amanda spoke again. "Michael usually works late. He'll probably be home in another hour or so. He's been very busy lately." Martha nodded, forcing a smile. "Yes, he's always been busy," she said, trying to keep the conversation light. But the words felt heavy in her mouth, loaded with all the years of missed phone calls, forgotten birthdays, and empty holidays. Amanda sat down across from her, crossing her legs and scrolling through her phone absent-mindedly. The distance between them was palpable, like an invisible barrier. Martha wanted to ask Amanda about her life, her work, or perhaps even about the children she and Michael didn't have. But the truth was, she didn't know where to begin. They had never really spoken, only polite exchanges during rare phone calls or brief encounters at family events that now seemed like a lifetime ago. "How's Michael been?" Martha asked finally, breaking the silence. Amanda looked up from her phone, clearly surprised by the question. "Oh, busy. Work is going really well. His firm just closed a huge deal, and there's always something new on the horizon." Martha nodded, though the response didn't satisfy her. It was the same story she had heard for years: work, business, deals. But what about Michael, her son? The boy who used to spend his weekends fishing with her by the lake, who once dreamed of becoming a writer before the corporate world consumed him. Was he happy? Did he ever think about her? "I'm proud of him," Martha said quietly, more to herself than to Amanda. Amanda smiled, but again it didn't reach her eyes. He's worked hard for everything he has. There it was again. The implication that Martha had somehow failed to understand Michael's success, that she couldn't possibly grasp the world he lived in now. The insinuation cut deeper than Amanda could have known. Just as the silence began to stretch again, the sound of keys turning in the front door echoed through the house. Martha's heart leaped into her throat. Michael. She straightened her posture, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed down the skirt of her dress. This was it, the moment she had traveled all this way for. Her son was finally home. The door swung open, and Michael stepped inside. He looked taller, more polished than she remembered. His dark hair was neatly styled, his suit crisp and expensive. He was every bit the image of a successful businessman, the embodiment of the life he had built. But to Martha, he was still her boy, the little boy who used to crawl into her lap after a bad dream, who used to tell her that he'd take care of her when he grew up. "Michael!" Martha called out, her voice filled with a mix of relief and longing. Michael paused mid-step, clearly surprised to see her. His expression was hard to read, caught somewhere between confusion and mild irritation. "Mom, what are you doing here?" The words stung, though Michael hadn't meant them to sound unkind. Martha rose slowly from the couch, forcing a smile onto her face despite the sudden tightness in her chest. I thought I'd surprise you," she said, her voice trembling just enough to betray her emotions. "It's been so long, and I wanted to see you." Michael glanced at Amanda, who was still seated, scrolling through her phone. Then he turned back to Martha, his brow furrowed. "You should have called," he said, his voice clipped. "I've been really busy, and I didn't know you were coming." The coldness of his tone cut through Martha like a knife. She had spent days, weeks, thinking about this visit, imagining how happy Michael would be to see her. She had pictured him embracing her, smiling at her with the warmth she remembered. But this was something entirely different. I didn't want to bother you," Martha stammered, her smile faltering. I thought it would be a nice surprise." Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's just bad timing, Mom. I got so much going on right now. Work is insane, and Amanda and we've been planning a trip." "Oh," Martha said softly, feeling the weight of her mistake. She had intruded, she realized. She had walked into Michael's life without considering that maybe he didn't have room for her anymore. There was a long, uncomfortable silence. Michael shifted awkwardly, and Amanda finally put down her phone, though she didn't offer any words of comfort. The three of them stood there, trapped in the tension of the moment, each waiting for the other to speak. Martha cleared her throat, trying to ease the tension. "I don't want to be a burden, Michael. I've missed you." Michael's expression softened slightly, but there was still a distance in his eyes. He walked over and gave her a quick, perfunctory hug. "I've missed you too, Mom," he said, though the words lacked the depth she had hoped for. "It's just, things are different now." Different. The word echoed in Martha's mind as she pulled back from the hug. Yes, things were different. Michael was different. His life, his world, it was all different. And she no longer belonged in it. As the night wore on, the small talk continued, but it was strained and uncomfortable. Martha tried to engage with Michael, to ask him about his work, his life, but the answers were always the same. Work was busy, life was hectic. There was no warmth, no real connection. And as the evening passed, Martha realized with a sinking heart that the son she had once known, the boy she had raised, was no longer the man standing before her. Martha sat in the guest room Amanda had shown her to. The door softly closed behind her. The room was beautiful, just like the rest of the house. Neatly decorated, with elegant furniture and bedding that felt almost too luxurious for her to touch. Yet, despite its beauty, it felt empty, much like the rest of the house. There was no warmth, no sense of home. She sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the delicate stitching of the quilt. Her mind wandered back to the earlier conversation, the coldness in Michael's voice still ringing in her ears. She had come all this way, hoping for a joyful reunion. but instead had been met with awkwardness, distance, and a painful realization that she no longer fit into his life. The warmth she had hoped to find here simply wasn't there. After a few moments of silence, Martha stood up, her legs stiff from the long journey and the weight of disappointment. She wasn't sure how long she would be staying, or if Michael even wanted her here at all. But she needed something to occupy her mind, something to ground her in this unfamiliar place. Quietly, she opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of a distant air conditioner. Michael and Amanda were likely still downstairs, talking, or perhaps going about their evening routines, unaware or uninterested in Martha's silent exploration of their home. As she wandered through the hall, her fingers brushing the walls, she noticed how pristine everything was. Every corner, every room seemed carefully curated, like a showroom rather than a home. Martha had always taken pride in keeping her own home tidy, but there had always been a sense of life in it. Pictures of Michael as a child, framed memories of holidays and birthdays, little knickknacks that held sentimental value. But here, there was nothing like that. No personal touches, no sense of family or history. Her eyes caught sight of a door slightly ajar at the end of the hallway. Curious, she moved toward it. When she gently pushed it open, she found herself in what appeared to be Michael's office. The room was sleek and professional, filled with bookshelves lined with business books and legal documents. On the desk, a laptop sat closed, alongside a neat stack of papers. It was just as orderly and impersonal as the rest of the house. As she stood in the doorway, her eyes scanned the room, landing on a bookshelf tucked into the corner. It was there that she spotted something that didn't quite match the rest of the decor. An old, weathered album, its edges worn from age. Intrigued, Martha stepped into the room and gently pulled the album from the shelf, her heart tightening as she recognized it. This was the photo album she had given Michael years ago, filled with memories of his childhood, moments she had cherished. With trembling hands, she opened it. The first few pages were just as she remembered them. Pictures of Michael as a baby, cradled in her arms, his tiny face lit up with the innocent smile of a child who knew nothing but love. There were photos of him playing in the backyard, his first day of school, holidays spent around the dinner table. Each image brought a flood of memories that overwhelmed her, the kind of memories that were precious to her but, as the years passed, seemed to mean less and less to Michael. But as she flipped through the album, something changed. About halfway through, the photos of their life together stopped. The rest of the album was filled with pictures she had never seen before. Pictures of Michael's life after he had left home. There were photos of him with colleagues at lavish parties, traveling to exotic locations, attending black tie events. Pictures of Michael's new world, his new life, the life he had built far from the modest home where he had grown up. Martha's heart sank as she looked at these images. In all these photos, Michael looked happy, surrounded by luxury and success. But there was no trace of her, no trace of the life they had once shared. It was as though he had left his past behind, and with it, any connection to his roots. The contrast between the two halves of the album was stark. One filled with love and family, the other with wealth and distance. She paused on one particular photo, Michael and Amanda standing in front of a sleek, modern home, smiling for the camera. It must have been taken around the time they bought this house. They looked so polished, so perfect. And yet, as Martha gazed at the picture, she felt the deep loneliness that had been creeping into her heart since she arrived take hold completely. Where did I go wrong? She wondered, her fingers tracing the edges of the photograph. She had done everything she could to give Michael a good life. She had worked tirelessly, sacrificed her own happiness to ensure he had opportunities she never had. She had raised him with love, with patience, with everything she had to offer. And now, here she was, sitting alone in a house that wasn't hers, flipping through a photo album that no longer included her. The truth hit her like a wave. Michael had moved on. He had built a life for himself, a life that didn't have room for her anymore. The visits, the phone calls, they had dwindled not because he was busy, but because somewhere along the way he had stopped needing her. Tears welled up in her eyes as she closed the album and placed it gently back on the shelf. She wiped her eyes quickly, not wanting to cry here, in this house where she already felt like an outsider. But the pain was hard to ignore. It wasn't just that Michael was busy. It was that he no longer thought of her as part of his world. She turned to leave the office, her heart heavy. But as she reached the door, she hesitated. There, sitting on the corner of the desk, was a small framed photograph. Martha picked it up, her breath catching in her throat as she recognized the image. It was a picture of her and Michael, taken years ago when he had just graduated from college. They were standing side by side, smiling, his arms slung around her shoulder. It was one of the last pictures she had of them together before everything changed. Martha held the photo close to her chest, her tears finally spilling over. She had given so much of herself to Michael, had built her life around him. But now, it seemed, she was just a memory, a forgotten chapter in the story of his success. With a deep, trembling breath, she placed the photo back on the desk and left the room. As she walked back to her guest room, the weight of her loneliness pressing down on her, she knew that this visit was not going to be what she had hoped. Michael's world had moved on without her, and she was left clinging to memories that no longer seemed to matter. The next morning, Martha woke early, long before the sun rose. She hadn't slept well. The weight of the previous night's discoveries pressed heavily on her chest, leaving her restless in a house that didn't feel like home. For hours, she had stared at the ceiling, replaying the awkward reunion with Michael over and over in her mind, her heart aching with every moment that passed. She dressed quietly, choosing one of her few modest outfits, clothes that suddenly felt out of place in the opulence surrounding her. As she moved through the silent halls of Michael's house, the polished floors cold under her feet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. The beautiful decor, the expensive art, even the light that filtered through the tall windows seemed foreign to her. It was as though she had entered a world that was closed off to her, a world Michael had built and filled with everything but her. As she made her way downstairs, she could hear soft murmurs coming from the kitchen. Michael was there, standing at the island counter, coffee in hand. His back was to her, and for a moment, Martha hesitated. There was something so unfamiliar about him now. His posture, the crisp lines of his designer shirt, the way he held himself with a kind of ease that was foreign to her. He seemed like a different person, a polished version of the boy she had raised. But he was still her son. That thought gave her the courage to approach. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice wavering slightly as she entered the room. Michael turned, surprised to see her up so early. For a brief moment, his expression softened, and Martha saw a flicker of the boy she remembered in his eyes. "Morning, Mom," he replied, though his tone was polite, not warm. Martha glanced around the kitchen, unsure of what to say. The tension from the night before still hung in the air, thick and unspoken. She desperately wanted to bridge the gap between them, to find a way back to the closeness they had once shared. But every time she opened her mouth to speak, the words felt heavy and uncertain. Michael cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You slept okay?" "Oh yes," Martha lied. "The bed was very comfortable." Michael nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. He leaned against the counter, his eyes avoiding hers. The silence between them stretched on again, awkward and painful. Martha took a deep breath, knowing she had to say something. She couldn't let this distance continue to grow. "Michael, I know it's been a while since we've spent time together," she began slowly, choosing her words carefully. "I've missed you." Her son looked at her, his brow furrowed slightly. He set his coffee cup down on the counter and crossed his arms over his chest, the defensive posture not lost on her. "I've missed you too, Mom," he said, though the words felt rehearsed, lacking the sincerity she longed to hear. I know you're busy," Martha continued, her voice small. "You've built such a wonderful life here. I'm so proud of you, Michael. You've accomplished so much." Michael gave a tight smile, but there was no warmth behind it. "Yeah, it's been a lot of hard work. I just wish we had more time together," Martha said, her eyes searching his face for any sign that he felt the same. "I feel like we've grown so far apart." At that, Michael sighed, his expression shifting to one of frustration. "Mom, it's not that we've grown apart. It's just, life happens, you know? I've been busy. I've got a lot going on with work. And Amanda and we've just got so much on our plate. I understand that, Martha said quickly, not wanting to sound accusing. But I didn't think I would lose you along the way. Michael's eyes flickered with something. Guilt, maybe, or annoyance. It was hard to tell. He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Mom, you haven't lost me. I'm still here. It's just, things are different now. Different. There was that word again. It had been haunting her since the night before. Martha swallowed hard, fighting the lump that was rising in her throat. What do you mean, different? We used to be so close, Michael. We used to talk all the time. Now I feel like I'm not part of your life anymore. Michael sighed again, his patience clearly wearing thin. It's not like that, Mom. I've just had a lot to deal with, okay? Work is demanding, and there's always something going on. I didn't mean to make you feel left out, but I have my own life now. The words hit Martha like a punch to the chest. I have my own life now. She had always known that Michael's world had grown larger, that he had carved out a place for himself in the world, but to hear him say it so plainly, that she was no longer part of that life, was almost too much to bear. She nodded slowly, her eyes cast down as she tried to keep her emotions in check. I see, she whispered, though in truth she didn't see. She couldn't understand how the boy she had once known had become so distant, so cold. Michael must have sensed her hurt, because he softened his tone slightly. Look, Mom, I'm not saying you're not important to me, but I've got a lot going on, and it's just hard to find time for everything. Martha forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. Of course, Michael. I didn't mean to imply otherwise. I just wanted to see you, that's all. It's been so long. I know, Michael said, though his voice was distant again. He glanced at his watch, clearly eager to move on from the conversation. I've got a meeting in an hour, so I should probably get ready. Oh, Martha said, startled by how quickly he was ready to leave her behind. Of course, I didn't mean to keep you. Michael nodded and started to walk out of the kitchen, but paused at the doorway. For a brief moment, it looked as though he might say something. Something important, something she desperately needed to hear. But instead, he simply said, "We'll catch up later. Okay?" Martha nodded, her heart heavy as she watched him walk away. Okay, Michael. Later. The moment he was gone, the kitchen felt impossibly large and empty. Martha stood there, staring at the floor, the silence pressing in on her. The words she hadn't said swirled in her mind, heavy with regret. She wanted to tell him how lonely she had been, how much she had missed him, how she still loved him more than anything in the world. But the distance between them felt too great, too wide to bridge with mere words. She moved slowly to the window, gazing out at the perfectly manicured garden outside. It was beautiful, just like everything else in Michael's life. But it wasn't hers. This wasn't her world. And for the first time, Martha began to realize that maybe she would never truly be a part of it. She placed her hand on the glass, the coolness seeping into her skin. When did everything change? She wondered. When had she lost her son to this life of wealth and success? A life that seemed to have no place for her. Martha stood there for a long time, watching the world outside move on without her. And for the first time in her life, she felt truly alone. Martha sat at the dining table later that afternoon, picking at a sandwich Amanda had made for her, though she barely touched it. The house was quiet again. Michael had left for his meeting hours ago, and Amanda had gone out to run errands, leaving Martha alone in the vast, empty house. She stared out the large windows, watching as the world outside continued to move, oblivious to the turmoil that churned inside her. She felt like a guest in her own son's life. No, not even a guest. A guest is welcomed, expected, appreciated. Martha was none of those things here. She was more like a shadow, lingering where she didn't belong, unwelcome and unnoticed. Her heart ached as she thought back to her conversation with Michael that morning. His words had been polite, but distant. It was as if he didn't see her, not really. Not the way a son should see his mother. Not the way he used to. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. She blinked, confused, unsure of who could be visiting. Slowly, she made her way to the front door, her joints stiff from the long hours of sitting in silence. When she opened the door, she was met by a young man in a delivery uniform, holding a large bouquet of expensive, pristine flowers. They were beautiful white lilies, bright roses, and delicate orchids arranged with such care that they seemed almost too perfect to touch. "Martha?" the delivery man asked, glancing down at his clipboard. "Yes, that's me," Martha said, surprised. "These are for you," the man said, handing her the flowers with a polite smile. "Enjoy." Martha took the bouquet, her heart swelling with a small flicker of hope. Maybe Michael had sent them as a way to apologize for his coldness, a way to show that he still cared, even if he struggled to express it. Her hands trembled slightly as she carried the flowers inside and set them gently on the kitchen counter. She searched the bouquet for a card, eager to see what message Michael had left for her. But when she found the card, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't from Michael. It was from Amanda. The message was simple, but its meaning was painfully clear. "Thank you for visiting, Martha. It's been lovely having you here. Safe travels." Martha stared at the card, her chest tightening with a crushing realization. Amanda was politely, and not so subtly, telling her it was time to go. She had overstayed her welcome. In fact, she hadn't been welcome at all. Her eyes filled with tears as she stood there, the beautiful bouquet now a symbol of rejection rather than affection. The truth was undeniable now. Amanda had never wanted her here, and Michael had gone along with it. He had allowed this distance to grow between them, allowed Amanda to quietly push her out of their lives. He had chosen this life, this world, over her. For so long, Martha had believed that the distance between her and Michael was circumstantial, a product of his busy schedule and the demands of his career. She had told herself that he still loved her, still cared, but was simply caught up in the whirlwind of his life. But now, holding that card in her hands, she understood the painful truth. Michael wasn't too busy. He wasn't too preoccupied with work. He had simply chosen to leave her behind. The realization shattered her. Martha felt her legs give out, and she sank slowly onto a kitchen stool, clutching the card in her trembling hands. The flowers in front of her blurred as tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, each one a painful reminder of the years she had lost, the love that had slowly slipped through her fingers. She thought about the early years after Michael had left for college, how he had called her every week, telling her about his classes, his friends, his dreams. Back then, he had still needed her, still valued the bond they shared. But slowly, as his success grew, as his world expanded, she had become a distant memory, a relic of a life he had outgrown. "I've been replaced," she thought, her heart breaking under the weight of it all. "By this life of luxury, by Amanda, by everything he values more than me." Suddenly, she was overwhelmed by the urge to leave, to escape this house that had become a prison of coldness and rejection. She couldn't stay here any longer, waiting for crumbs of affection from a son who had already moved on. She had her pride, her dignity, and she wasn't going to sit here and pretend that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Martha wiped her tears with the back of her hand, steeling herself. She would leave before Michael returned, before there could be any more painful conversations or empty promises. She would leave quietly, just as she had come, and return to the life she knew. A simple life, perhaps, but one where she wasn't constantly reminded of what she had lost. She made her way upstairs to the guest room, pulling out her small suitcase and carefully folding her clothes into it. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as though each action was a step toward reclaiming some semblance of control over her life. She couldn't control Michael's choices, couldn't force him to love her the way he once had, but she could control how much more pain she allowed herself to endure. As she packed, she glanced around the room, making sure she hadn't left anything behind. Her eyes landed on the small framed photo of her and Michael she had found the night before in his office. The picture of them at his college graduation, smiling, their arms wrapped around each other. She hesitated for a moment, then gently placed the photo in her suitcase. It was one of the few reminders she had of the love they once shared. And even if that love had faded for Michael, it hadn't for her. Once she was packed, Martha made her way back downstairs. She left the bouquet of flowers on the kitchen counter, untouched, along with the card. It was a quiet gesture, but one that spoke volumes. She didn't need flowers as a consolation prize. What she needed, what she had always needed, was her son. As she reached the front door, her hand paused on the handle. For a brief moment, she considered leaving a note, something to explain her sudden departure. But then she stopped herself. What could she possibly say that hadn't already been said? The truth was clear, and no amount of words would change it. With a heavy heart, Martha opened the door and stepped outside. The crisp afternoon air hit her face, a stark contrast to the suffocating stillness inside the house. She felt a sense of relief, mixed with a deep sadness. This wasn't how she had imagined her visit would go. She had hoped for a reunion, a chance to reconnect with her son. But now, as she walked away, suitcase in hand, she realized that some things were beyond repair. As she reached the end of the driveway, she glanced back one last time at the house, a symbol of everything Michael had built, everything he had chosen. It was beautiful, grand, and impressive, but it was also empty, at least to her. And with that, Martha turned away and started her long journey home, leaving behind the life she no longer recognized. Chapter 6. A silent goodbye. The journey back to her quiet home in North Carolina was long, but Martha barely noticed the passing miles. She sat in her seat on the bus, staring out the window as the cityscape of New York faded behind her, replaced by the rolling countryside she had always known. Her mind replayed the last few days, each moment heavy with disappointment, sadness, and a sense of loss she hadn't fully prepared for. She had come to New York with a heart full of hope, believing that seeing Michael would heal the distance between them. But now, as she sat alone, the truth settled deep into her bones. She was no longer part of her son's life, at least not in the way she once had been. The boy she had raised, nurtured, and loved so deeply had grown into a man whose world no longer had room for her. The thought was almost too much to bear. The bus rumbled along the highway, and Martha closed her eyes, letting the gentle rocking soothe her. For so long, she had tried to hold onto the idea that her bond with Michael was unbreakable, that despite the years of separation, they would always find their way back to each other. But people change, lives change, and sometimes, even the strongest bonds can be worn down by time and distance. Her heart ached with the knowledge that the relationship she had once cherished was gone, replaced by something cold and unfamiliar. Michael had made his choices, and though it hurt more than words could express, she knew she had to accept them. She couldn't force him to be the son he once was, just as she couldn't force herself to fit into his new world. It was a painful lesson in letting go. As the bus drew closer to her small town, Martha felt a wave of relief wash over her. There was something comforting about returning to the simplicity of her own life, even if it felt emptier now. Her little house, modest and unadorned, would be waiting for her. It wasn't filled with luxury or expensive things, but it was hers. And in its quiet rooms, she could find some solace in the memories she still held dear. By the time the bus pulled into the station, the sun had begun to set, casting a soft golden light over the town. Martha gathered her belongings, her movements slow and deliberate, and stepped off the bus. The cool evening air brushed against her skin, and she took a deep breath, feeling the familiar scent of home. The walk to her house was short, but with each step, she felt the weight of the past few days lifting, little by little. There was still an emptiness inside her, a deep sadness that would take time to heal, but she also knew that life would go on. She had lived through loss before, and though this one felt different, more personal, she would survive it too. When she reached her front door, she paused for a moment, her eyes lingering on the old wooden frame. It wasn't much, but it had been the backdrop to so many memories, both happy and sad. She had raised Michael here in this very house. She had watched him grow, celebrated his achievements, and now, she had said her silent goodbye to him here as well. With a steady hand, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The familiar creak of the floorboards greeted her, and for the first time in days, Martha felt a sense of peace. The house was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt like home. She set her suitcase down in the hallway, her eyes briefly falling on a framed photo of Michael on the mantel, taken years ago when he still smiled freely in her presence. She smiled softly at the memory, her fingers brushing against the frame. No matter how much things had changed, she would always carry the love she had for her son. It was a love that couldn't be erased, even by time, distance, or painful goodbyes. Martha sat down in her favorite armchair by the window, the fading light casting soft shadows across the room. She closed her eyes, letting herself rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring a new day. She wasn't sure what the future held for her and Michael, but she had learned something important in these past few days. Sometimes, love meant letting go. And while that truth was hard to accept, it was also necessary. The road ahead would be uncertain, but Martha knew she had the strength to walk it, just as she always had. Before you go, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us grow and continue sharing stories like this one. Every like, comment, and subscription makes a huge difference, and we appreciate each and every one of you. If this story moved you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.